Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with our global multi-stakeholder community, representing national and local governments, international policymakers, civil society, NGOs, the ICT industry, as well as other relevant organizations and institutes.
I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Peter Batt. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Fritz. Nice to see you, and thank you for having me.
Yes. Peter is the former Director General for Digital Society, Digitalization of the Administration and IT with the Federal Ministry for Interior, Building and Community in Germany. So basically, you were Germany government's CIO.
I can relate to this description.
Yes. Now, at the time, one of the main topics you were responsible for is helping to set up an e-government. And if I read up on what Germany was doing at the time, it was a very big investment in broadband technology to get everybody online. And I would like to have a conversation with you, how you balance, I would say, the need, the urge, the desire to use technology, but also make certain that it's still safe and secure. So, and also I want to tell the people you have a law background, you're educated as a lawyer. So you have a balance between the legal side and the IT side. So how
dangerous half knowledge of information technology that balances my education as a lawyer.
Okay. Now, could you tell us how do you prioritize decisions when you see a need for implementing digital technology to get people online and make sure that it's still safe? How do you approach that?
Well, in the first place, it is important to know that Germany, as lots of other countries too, are well behind in digitization. We saw this when the pandemic struck, and the infrastructure that you needed to keep up education as we knew it via the internet and to keep businesses going, that the infrastructure was simply not in place. This is an issue that followed German politics now for years and years. And there was a growing need to be faster. And of course, the pandemic just boosted this recognition. So what we had to do is being faster, okay, and Germany is famous for its bureaucracy, so be a bit less bureaucratic about it, and at the same time keeping up the quality that you need to be sustainable in what you do. It's a problem for many industrialized countries that they are not so far behind when you look at the big picture, but they were very good very early because we have data processing, automated data processing since 1950s or 1960s. So we have legacy systems that have to be replaced to be fit for the digital age. So speed and innovating on the one hand, and keeping up quality on the other hand is what you need to do. I always had an example that is agility is fantastic. Yeah. But you don't want an agile surgeon to perform an agile and experimental surgery on you. So you like to be rather sure that he knows what he's doing. So when it comes to critical infrastructure, to infrastructure that is needed beyond the day you are living for, then you need to be very careful what you do. But at the same time, you have to cut back all that is too bureaucratic and that impedes development.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say the whole global pandemic actually highlighted the fact that we live in a digital era.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting. Was very interesting to watch. Is still very interesting to watch. Information technology is, by its nature, it's not haptic. You can't explain to your grandmother what is going on in a computer. Even if you open it up and be as transparent as you can as a customer of Apple or Samsung or someone like that, you can't really explain what is happening inside this shell. So that's really a problem that people have to deal with. In the Middle Age, we would have all been burned because no one could have understood what we're really doing. So this is a problem, but the pandemic highlighted what the digital age can do for us on one hand, and on the other hand, it showed very clearly where our vulnerabilities lie. And the chip crisis that in part is a direct consequence of the pandemic, that showed people who don't even own a smartphone that they must now wait for their washing machine 8 months or so because there are not enough chips to get it delivered on time. So this is an experience that every citizen makes, and I think it strengthens the awareness of what the digital age means, and that we have to look out for new things that we were not used to look out for. And I think that's per se a good direction that we are now taking as a society.
Okay, and what's the responsibility of government in this case? As you said, okay, society is now being aware, hey, we live in a digital era. Federal society, government, what's their role in this case?
Their role is very important. We have now had 18 months or so where our freedom, our basic rights were taken away for the greater good, of course, but they were taken away. And we saw that things that were quite normal for us. I think of all the controls we left behind with the Schengen agreement within the European Union. They are now a thing of the past. We do not even know if there ever will be a situation where we come back to the freedom of movement that we used to know in the late 90s. So the role of the governments is to look beyond the pandemic, to create unity where consensus is needed, to have effective control and enforcement of global rules. I think that what the group of governmental experts 5 years ago or so decided, and it was difficult getting there, they simply said international law applies. That was a landmark that Chinese, Russian, and American people agreed to this basis. So when we talk about things like the digital tax, for example, it's always, it's very human, because I myself, I'm sorry too that I have no part in the revenues that Apple and the other big tech companies make. So I can feel with what our budget committee in the parliament thinks. But the basis is that the consensus on tax was another one. Mm-hmm. That where your registered headquarter is, you pay the tax. This was the basis. So you can be emotionally very much for having paychecks from Apple, but this was not the consensus. So you need a new consensus if you, and this is very far-reaching, because it, of course, it concerns car producers too. You need a new consensus of how to pay tax in the digital world, so that when big tech makes business in one country, they have to pay tax there too. But it's not only big tech, it's all companies. So this is very, very important. And just today, I read in a newspaper that the G7 that called for this new consensus on tax, on the digital tax, that President Biden will have very, very difficult time to convince his two chambers of parliament to agree to what he proposed. So very difficult, it will take a long time, but it is a good example of what to do. You have to have a political consensus of the big blocs, and of course within the European Union first, from our point of view, on what you intend to do, how to make it feasible on a global scale, and you have to talk with one another and to get there step by step.
Okay, so am I now hearing you saying that when we talk about the need for accountability in a digital age, one of the things which one of the stakeholders, the providers of technology, need to do is basically pay their taxes? Is one way to be held accountable.
This is one example. This is one example of global rules that you agree on. And I think that it is a good example, because it's always critical when it comes to money. But of course, there's more when it comes to privacy, to basic human rights that have to be defended in the face of what big tech, of social media, what they do. Then it's important that you have new mechanisms. You knew all about international courts, of course, being in The Hague makes it easy to think in these dimensions. But the essence is that you will need, for example, international system of ombudspeople or such like. You still need to democratically legitimize them, but you need new mechanisms. It is no longer possible to have a national Supreme Court issuing warnings or voting for splitting up big companies when the rest of the world doesn't take notice. So think about new mechanisms, agree on them, and that is what, as an example, people did and the G7 did when they met last time on digital tax.
Okay, so as far as you're concerned, what the G7 has done is very much moving things in the right direction.
Yeah,
and
they did, and simply agreeing on this way.
Okay, now what, in your view, is the biggest threat for accountability today?
Yeah, I talked about political unity, so uh, it was rather terrifying watching what the pandemic did to this, because all the immediately taken measures were taken nationally. And there has to be a review on what exactly the countries, especially in the European Union, did, and what the European Commission could have done. So this is very important. I think that it is also, of course, and there we talk about cybersecurity, of course, an opening that we have now another awareness at all of, for example, are evil. Just these days in the newspaper, ransomware attacks. These were news that were hidden in the last few pages of a newspaper. Nowadays, when it comes to critical infrastructure and a health crisis like the pandemic that struck, then you have a problem that immediately interests every one citizen. So you have a new awareness, and this is always look at the bright side of things, but cybersecurity issues being too fast. I talked about quality earlier on. Being too fast for their own good and disregarding security measures, not bringing in enough professionals to help you digitize. This is really a threat because people can become very afraid of digitization if this happens too often and dominates the way you're thinking about digitization.
But how realistic do you think you can slow down technological development? Because once it's out there, there's always going to be people who want to use that. Yep. So I understand the thinking that we need to slow things down, but is that going to happen?
I'm not exactly saying that you should slow things down. I'm saying that you have to be very careful to have people's acceptance. We can't digitize and leave the society behind. My mantra was always leave no one behind. We have digital gaps within our country, women and men, the old ones and young ones, cities and rural areas. People of higher education, people of not so high education. You have the same with countries. And you have to be very careful not to leave behind people and create divisions and new gaps. This is important to me. And to answer your question directly, no, of course, the progress cannot be stopped or even slowed down. But we need to acknowledge that you need to change in a way that people were not asked to change in centuries before. Take the security people, for example. There are secret services, even in Luxembourg. Every country has one. And for centuries, literally centuries, they lived by a dogma that was called need to know. Keep all the information to yourself. Information is power, and only tell people about the information you have when it's absolutely necessary. In a digital age, you change to need to share. In an interconnected global world where you have to fight criminals globally, it is not possible to stay with a need to know. That means that you go into the very DNA of what the people working for security and secret services and so on, what they live their whole life. And you have to change the way that supervision takes place. You have now to control, to analyze algorithms, code. You have to study access protocols and analyze them. How is data processing organized and so on. So digitization changes the organization of the society as a whole. And this small example that I just described makes clear how very deep this goes against what many people learned from being a small girl or boy on.
Yeah, and that almost seems like almost too much responsibility or workload for just a government to handle. I was wondering who you feel should really be at the table to resolve this.
I would like to come back to my proposition to have internationally established ombudspeople or arbitrary courts. You have to be very careful how to choose them because you need to have acceptance there too. If this is an anonymous institution somewhere where no citizen can relate to, you would generate new problems. So be very careful who you choose, but we need these globally accepted institutions, and we need them very fast. And what you need, and I think the pandemic showed this very clearly, you need to have a very, very strong interdisciplinary approach. That medical people who know their virus by the walk are very important, okay. But you need psychologists, you need people that come from social science, and you need people that know their way around the implications when it comes to education and so on. So you have to have know-how from very diverse sectors to make this effective. Okay, and so I think it is not done with choosing government representatives to be alone responsible for this.
Well, that's actually quite an ambitious solution, but to summarize what I'm hearing you saying is this is a global issue, but it's not just having the IT professionals come together, or maybe just with the legal professionals. It's very much a multi-stakeholder discussion.
Yeah, it is.
Otherwise, we're not going to get there.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's necessary to do exactly what you said. It's only one step further from having hearings or so with a multi-stakeholder approach. But we made too much mistakes in the past when we excluded many people that were responsible for important decisions. The ICT community kept a bit to itself. They had this elitist approach and were within this eggshell where one knows another and they are being buddy-buddy. But this is not enough. This was never enough. We had to talk to people from the interior, from the economic side, from justice, and it's perhaps not too late to go there, but it can't be a thing of information technology community or hacker communities or such alike. So
No, I
broader.
agree. Yeah, no, I do agree. The current pandemic has made it quite clear. Now, a twofold question, if I may. First of all, who should drive this discussion as you are aiming for, and what could the role be of the Institute for Accountability in that discussion?
First of all, if the Commission realizes that it has to gain speed, then the European Commission would be the ideal source of taking the initiative. Because you have here a community of countries, and they are per definitionem, they are multilingual, they are multi-stakeholder oriented. So I would address the European Commission first.
Okay.
They are now accepted on a global scale as a partner within G7 and so on. So they sit at the table. And you have what you do not have in Germany. For example, we changed the government now in 3 months' time. The European Commission has some sort of continuity that the other big blocs do not have in a similar fashion. So this is the way to go. And I think I talked about hearings, and I talked about including initiatives. I think I4ADA, for example, should be in a counseling role. And when you talk to people from the Commission, they need something not done the way that Neelie Kroes in her time did it, because she personally chose some people that she knew. You don't have to do it this way, but you should have a very broad approach, and perhaps having hearings that are very, very big to start with, and then narrow it down. And I think that we within the Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age, with all the global experience that already has come in, can play a very important role in counseling the people in the Commission.
Well, that very much describes the role we want to take, facilitate for that discussion to happen as a catalyst. But nobody owns this discussion. It's very much a global discussion we should have. And one final question for me, Peter, before I let you go. Describe your ideal world.
Oh, this will take longer than you perhaps think it will. No, to keep it simple, that is a world where people talk to one another, they listen to one another, and they learn from one another. I think it is very, very important to come back to some basic values that denominated where we come from, how much humanity has learned in these last few hundred years compared to all the time before that is incredible. But it only comes from wanting to learn. So the ideal world: talk to one another, listen to one another, and learn from one another.
Well, at least we discussed the risks of modern digital technology, but I also see you're ending with one of the benefits modern digital technology is giving us. We are actually able to talk to each other on a global level like we're doing right now. So thank you for sharing your insights, Peter, and well, let's make it happen.
Let's make it happen. Thank you very much again, and thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to see you personally sometime soon.